Focused on quality and convenience, there isn't much you won't find at Marie's Mini Mart. Home-style breads, sandwiches, plus a variety of artisan breads and delicious single-serve desserts available exclusively at our Frecker Drive location. Marie's Mini Mart, with 25 locations wherever you go, there we are.
Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today is a history scholar with expertise in the story of Newfoundland and Labrador. He is currently the director of the Basilica Heritage Foundation, and the basilica of which I speak is, of course, the Basilica Cathedral of St. John the Baptist here in St. John's, Newfoundland, which was, believe it or not, a few years ago in jeopardy of sorts. It was up for sale, and there was no telling what might happen to it. It could have ended up becoming condominiums, for heaven's sake. But thankfully, it was saved from that by the Basilica Heritage Foundation, and my guest today was key in that project, the saving of the Basilica. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. John Fitzgerald to the program. Welcome, John.
Karl, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
John, before we talk about the Basilica itself, the Basilica is part of something called the Ecclesiastical District of St. John's. What exactly does that mean?
It's a collection of buildings and institutions that occupies about 60 acres, 61 acres in downtown St. John's, and the whole works has been designated a National Historic Site of Canada by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada and the Government of Canada.
Why?
Because of its outstanding contribution to the heritage, the culture, the built heritage, and the social development of Newfoundland and Labrador society. So this would include, you mentioned the Basilica where I work, but it would include the Anglican Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. It would include Gower Street United Church, the home of Methodism, the home of the United Church of Canada, really in some ways the cathedral almost of that denomination.
Which I believe, and I stand to be corrected, I think it is probably one of the oldest United Churches in Canada.
It certainly would be approximating or approaching that, and it's well, any of us who've been in it know how glorious that building is. It's stunning.
Yeah.
And the other big institution there is St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, the Kirk, the Presbyterian Kirk. So it's not just those churches; it's their residences, their parish halls, the fraternal organizations that were once part of these church organizations. It's the schools and the school districts. In some cases, up over the hill, it's, for example, like the convents. It's the graveyards. It's the cradle-to-grave social and cultural world that these institutions created, mostly in the 19th century. We are talking now between the 1830s, 40s, and after the Great, up until after the Great Fire, where everything was rebuilt, and we haven't really lost anything by fire since 1892. But there have obviously been some changes. So it's a National Historic District created in 2007. The Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador and the City of St. John's petitioned the Historic Sites and Monuments Board to designate it. Would you believe that all of the churches were not really aware of our collective identity as part of this until about, well, just before the eve of the COVID pandemic, when we started working together? We have a working group, and we offer tours. We compare strategies for increasing visitor numbers. We try to interpret the buildings, and we train young people and tour guides and give them exposure to all these buildings and all these cultures, because we think it's good for people to be able to speak about it and know about it. It's collectively part of our Newfoundland and Labrador and our Canadian heritage.
So let's talk about the basilica now.
Sure.
Before the basilica was built, there was obviously a Roman Catholic community in St. John's. So there must have been a church building. So where did the flock go? Where was it?
So it was on Henry Street. It was behind, as you, of course, would know, the old CBC on Duckworth Street. It was really almost directly behind that, a little bit to the west. And it's where the condominium building is now, the modern condominium building behind the Sprout Cafe. And that was the old Catholic chapel from, the congregation dates from about 1784. They were in that building by the turn of the 19th century. I'm going to say 1896. I think something tells me, or it may have been 86, that they were in that building. But the interesting thing about it was that was their home until about 1829, when a young man named Michael Fleming, who had been a Catholic priest, decided that he'd just become bishop, and he realized that he had a chapel, a building that held 300 people, but his congregation numbered 10,000, about 10,000, because it was the only Roman Catholic sort of church in St. John's at the time. So that's when they decided they needed a bigger facility. And they made a number of petitions to the English government in the UK. He made 5 trips across the Atlantic and toing and froing. Those days, we say across the Atlantic. Before Samuel Cunard's steamship came into St. John's Harbor in 1842 or 43, a one-way voyage across the North Atlantic typically took between 50 and 70 days in a sailing vessel.
Wow.
So to make 5 return trips, he must have been pretty determined to have that bit of land. The land that they wanted was to the east of Fort Townsend. It was William's plantation. And it was variously used throughout the 18th century as a berry picking ground. It was used for mummering, for the citizens of St. John's to go mummering. They held faction fights there, the Irish did, according to Judge Prowse. And they thought Fleming was sort of crazy to want to put it there.
I want to talk about Fleming. Was he a Newfoundlander, by the way?
No, he wasn't. He was born on Lord Bessborough's estate in County Kilkenny, right next to a little town called Carrick-on-Soar.
So he was an Irishman.
He was an Irishman.
Now, he must have been an extraordinary individual, because he not only, dreamt of having a nice big new church. I mean, his idea for a church was supersized, as we like to say today.
It was.
I mean, where did he get such big ideas from?
Such grandiose vision. He was a Franciscan. He was an Irish Franciscan, but the Order of St. Francis. And in Assisi, in Italy, there's a church called the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi, which is now almost 1,000 years old. And that building would have been well known to the Franciscans. And he saw the idea of this triangular gable at the end with the circle, the oculus. He saw this tower. And they all had it in their minds to sort of maybe do something like that. That's what Franciscans did. They did other things in terms of architecture as well. They built very austere buildings outside, but inside they built them in a splendiferous way, because they felt that architecturally this had to speak to God's creation, which was splendiferous, which was a gift, and which was supposed to inspire humanity. Right?
So he drew inspiration from the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi.
It did. The other interesting thing is the Franciscans aligned these buildings according to the solstices. We didn't recognize that in the St. John's Basilica until we went looking at the stained glass windows, and we realized that the sun set in one end and rose in the other. Rose on the south side hills. And my friend and colleague Shane O'Day, formerly of the university, wrote a very important article about the downtown architecture, and he talked about the basilica, and it doesn't face the Narrows, it doesn't face the harbour, it doesn't face south, it doesn't face Riverhead or the the Waterford River. He didn't actually say where it faced, because it didn't occur to us to look at that until we asked, why were the stained glass windows put where they were? And they actually chose the windows to go in like they'd gone in a medieval church in Europe, in Chartres in France, and that's exactly what the Franciscans did in a number. They also did it, by the way, I'm sure some of your viewers will be aware, there are a number of Franciscan Spanish mission churches from the late 18th, the early 19th century in places like San Jose, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and on it goes in California.
Yeah.
So, in fact, they weren't sort of doing stuff that was unknown. They'd just been at it for almost 1,000 years.
So Fleming went in search of an architect, and he came up with pretty much the perfect guy
for this stuff
in Europe.
For this stuff, the guy he came up with was a guy named Ole Jørgen Schmidt, architect of the Danish government, but resident at just outside Hamburg, which is now in Germany, at Altona on the Elbe River. Schmidt had taken his architectural education in Rome, and he had studied neoclassical architecture. Now that's the place to go. I'm looking at some of the beautiful stuff behind you there, and there's a classical column right behind you. That's the place. If you want to go see classical architecture, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, right? You'll see the columns and the cornices, and you'll see the capitals and everything else.
And he didn't just design, John, he didn't just design a church, a basilica church. He designed something that encompassed a series of buildings and grounds, a precinct, in other words, didn't he?
He did. So you not only had the basilica, you had the Presentation Convent, then you had the Archbishop's residence or the Bishop's residence in 1850. You had the library behind it. Then you had other architects like James Purcell who worked on some of the basilica, but who did like the colonial building with its columns, right? They'd worked on, so there arose in St. John's this architectural profession that was working on all these kinds of things. And this is the age, especially after the Great Fire of 1846, when you start to see all of the major churches in downtown St. John's coming in with their magnificent architecture, and many of the stonemasons, Patrick Keogh and the stonecutters and others, they worked on more than one building. And then after the fire of 1896, the basilica, 92, the basilica didn't burn. Some of the other ones did, but they were rebuilt, and they were rebuilt in magnificent styles. I think of Gower Street United, for example, with the magnificent hammer beam ceiling, and red crushed velvet throughout, and you can put 1,500 people into the building, but but you can hear with the right person in the pulpit or the right person singing, you can hear it as if you're sitting next to them. The acoustics are splendid, and something like a big pipe organ, a massive pipe organ like is down at Gower, you get these effects. So the idea was really to create the best that they could. So they did that with the basilica, they did it with the other churches in that ecclesiastical
Now, was there any resistance to the, I mean, I'm imagining now in the 1840s, members of the church looking at these plans and thinking, it's too much, it's too costly, it's too audacious.
It's not suited to our station,
right.
as someone once said.
Yes, so was there much pushback?
There was some. And there was some from within his own congregation, Fleming, and there was some from within the local colonial government. But I guess the thing about him was he outlasted them all. And it took 14 years. He'd been building this thing for 14 years. Wasn't without a little bit of trickery. He sent a set of plans over to London that showed sort of an inverted church in a small building, and a school nearby, and a convent, and other things. And when he ended up building it, this massive footprint, I recently discovered on Wikipedia this basilica in St. John's is listed as about the 85th largest church in the world. It's massive. It's enormous. It's over 3 million cubic feet inside, right? That's an enormous volume of space.
It is. Yeah.
But yeah, there was some resistance, but it didn't stop. It didn't stop the ordinary people of the town, the plain people of Ireland, as they used to say in Ireland. Well, the plain people of Newfoundland, from seeing that this was an investment in their community, in a very permanent medium, Newfoundland granite, 35,000 tons of it, as well as stones and bricks from Europe and England, and especially Ireland, and work of stonemasons. We didn't have a lot of stonemasons and stonecutters in Newfoundland, so they tended to cut the stuff in Europe, put it on ships as ballast, and send it over, and then send the fish back in the vessels, right? So it was an enormous investment in the community, and there are stories of women and children with aprons, scrabbling up, excavating the stone. They excavated the place right down to the bedrock, and they put this thing up, and it took 14 years to build.
I have to mention this because this, when I read this story, I found it incredible. Fleming himself donned workman's clothes, went to Kelly's Island, pitched a tent, lived on Kelly's Island, and actually helped the stone cutters over there excavate this stone on Kelly's Island from the quarry there.
In February, up to his knees and waist in water, hefting blocks onto small vessels to go onto larger vessels to come around to St. John's. Why February? Because we had no paved roads. There was no concrete. There was no pavement. There were muddy cart tracks for most of the year, and then there was frozen ground. So it was much easier to move tons of stone in a sled or toboggan over frozen ground than it was to actually try to do this in the middle of the summer. And besides, people were fishing.
Talk about getting, becoming hands-on.
Yeah,
it just
was. In a way that most of us wouldn't conceive of
It's
today.
amazing. I mean, he was the bishop.
Yeah, but I think he was also one of those people, we all know the type, that would not ask someone to do something that they wouldn't be willing to do themselves.
Right. Yeah.
One of the people who wrote about him, one of the historians who wrote about him once made, I think, an accurate observation to say he was the kind of person who dealt in causes rather than personalities. And I think that drove him. If ever there was a driven person in Newfoundland and Labrador history, this is one of them, because they really felt they were going to try to achieve something. By the way, it wasn't just a bunch of building blocks and stone. It was an institutional way of developing society. He brought over 2 orders of religious women, the Presentation and the Mercy Nuns, open cemeteries, open schools, encouraged the fraternal societies and other groups like that. They had all kinds of parades. Now, he also got up to his eyeballs in Newfoundland politics. We could talk about that all night. But suffice to say, he saw the world, can you blame him, I suppose, from an Irish perspective and an Irish lens, which might have been fine for Ireland, but it wasn't exactly always going to inspire everyone on this side of the Atlantic. So he had his enemies. He had his political enemies. But especially after the fire of the 1840s,
that's interesting, John, because I was just thinking, this was such it was almost like a mega project back in the day, and I mean, St. John's obviously doesn't just consist of people from Ireland, Roman Catholics. It consists of a lot of English and so on and so forth who were Protestants, and so, but. Was the basilica totally constructed using Roman Catholic labor, Roman Catholic money, or was the entire community of St. John's involved? The
entire community was involved, and that was an astonishing reality for the 1840s and 50s. If I can excuse myself for saying this, when the basilica was sold to compensate the victims of sexual abuse. It was a tragic, terrible thing that it would have to be sold, but it was absolutely essential. The people deserved compensation, period. And who came to the rescue? The people of St. John's, the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, people of Canada, Americans and Europeans, and they were not all Roman Catholic.
No, certainly not.
No, many of them wanted to preserve a National Historic Site. Many of them thought, when the 5 developers from Toronto actually walked in and did want to turn it into condominiums, they were horrified by the idea of us losing a National Historic Site of that size and scale. And as you know, I mean, it's not just a Roman Catholic church. It's used for Handel's Messiah. It's used for Shelby. It's used for many of the great provincial occasions.
But it's always been an extremely important landmark in the city. Yeah. It's an iconic building.
Very much so.
It's a one-of-a-kind building. Not just that building, but the other buildings that surround it. And the people of St. John's, especially somebody like myself who grew up in this city, I mean, I love the building.
Right.
And I'm not a Catholic, but you know, I've driven past it so many times in my life with my father, for example, going to the wholesalers.
Right.
You know, it's just one of those buildings that you love to look at and you admire. You're in awe of it. It's a wonderful building. So,
but I will say this too, and I mean, I'll defend Basilica, but I feel the same way about the Anglican Cathedral.
Yes.
Gower Street United.
Yes, we have a lot of those buildings.
We have, and they are. I think they are some of the most special buildings because the societies and the organizations and the educational opportunities they helped to create in this society at that time. We may not be there now, okay? But what they helped to create formed and created the history of this province in a very substantial way. And they're almost like the touchstones, the cultural touchstones of being a Newfoundlander or a Labradorian. You don't have to belong to any of those creeds to go in them and love them and see that people quite clearly sacrificed for generations to put them all where they are, right?
Just to get back to Bishop Fleming.
Sure.
The poor fellow didn't live to see it totally completed. It was his successor, after Fleming passed away, it was his successor, Bishop Mullick, who oversaw the completion because really the sanctuary itself, the interior, was not complete, was it?
It was a rough stone building when Fleming died in July of 1850. He had the first Mass there on January the 6th, Old Christmas Day. But it took 5 more years for Mullick to complete it, and which they did in 1855. And they had the most famous Irishman in America, who was the Catholic Archbishop of New York, John Hughes. He preached the sermon at the opening, and then apparently he went back to New York and said to them, look, if those fishermen in Newfoundland can build that place, we can build St. Patrick's Cathedral. Now, it wasn't the same. The Basilica is neoclassical, it's rounded arches. St. Patrick's is Gothic with the pointed arches. But the idea was stone outside, plaster inside, and some kind of a big cultural statement. So these buildings inspire and inspired across the globe. There are actually buildings in France and in Ireland and other places that were inspired by the St. John's Basilica, as well as throughout Newfoundland and Labrador in one way or another. You can sort of see the architecture. It's like that with the churches, with the churches of the major denominations. You look at the Anglican Cathedral, you know, you can go to Torbay, I think it's St. Nicholas. There's other churches throughout that have the neo-Gothic style. And I mean, these buildings become sort of the standard for what's done throughout what at that point was a British colony and an early dominion, right? They set the standard. They become what people recognize as the form of a church or the form of a public building.
Now, the Basilica Sanctuary houses some great works of art, wonderful religious icons. Talk about the ones that are most significant historically or artistically.
Sure. There are 2 big artists there. One is the most famous Irish sculptor of the 19th century, named John Hogan, who studied in Rome. And then he returned and he did this statue called the Dead Christ. There's one of those in under the altar at the Basilica. There's one in Dublin. There's another one in Cork, and there's a plaster version in Cork in the Municipal Art Gallery. It's a masterpiece of the neoclassical style among those people who understand what that is and know it much better than I do. But they say that these things are supposed to be magnificent. The other artist, and people will see it, they don't even have to go in the building, they drive by, they can see there's a statue of the Virgin Mary out on a plinth in front of the Basilica, and on the steps there's St. Patrick, of course Irish, what do you expect, and Francis of Assisi. Fleming and Muller were Franciscans. But those statues were done by an Irish artist named John Edward Carew, who spent most of his working life in England and was one of Irish heritage, but was one of England's best neoclassical or naturalistic style sculptors. He did the bas relief, the tablet of the death of Nelson at Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square, which is seen by millions of people a day, with its partially famous inscription, "England expects that every man shall do his duty, J.E. Carew sculpt." Well, they don't remember the J.E. Carew sculpt bit, but they do remember England expects. So we have this stuff here in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's quite astonishing that we have these incredible works of art in marble.
So, John, just want to make sure I get this in. So, what is the significance of the honorific basilica, and when did the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist receive? When was this bestowed upon our building?
Sure. So it still remains a cathedral. And in fact, there are several cathedrals in this town. And they're cathedrals because they have a cathedra, which is a chair for a bishop or the leader of the local church. So the basilica has a green chair, and it's the chair of the bishop, or the archbishop in this case. It's a basilica. It's been a basilica as an honorary title since about 1955, when for the 100th anniversary, the Pope of the day, Pius XII, designated it. And it's almost like being designated a National Historic Site. It's given because it's of outstanding historical, cultural, artistic, spiritual merit, or however you would construe that if you're in the Vatican trying to figure out what to name these buildings. Architecturally, it is a basilica. It's an oblong building with a semicircular back, and the early Christians took over the basilicas in ancient Rome, and Caesar used to have his seat in the semicircular back and hold court and all the rest of it. So the Christians took them over and began having church there. So they began having church in basilicas that were abandoned by the emperors.
John, we're out of time, but it was a great conversation, very interesting and informative. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate your presence here today.
You're welcome.
That's it for this edition of Karl Wells Point to Point. We'll see you again next time.
If you want convenience, Marie's Mini Mart is here for you. A one-stop shop for a variety of products, home-style breads, sandwiches, plus check out our freshly baked artisan breads and single-serve desserts exclusively at our in-store bakery on Frecker Drive. With 25 locations, wherever you go, there we are.
We want to hear from you. Provide feedback on this show or find out how you can get involved. Call, email us, or scan the QR code to take our quick survey.
With Rogers TV, you can cheer on the home team from the comfort of your living room. We'll head to the rink, the field, the court, or the pitch, so you don't have to. Tune in and cheer on your local amateur athletes on Rogers TV.
You're watching Rogers TV.
This program is brought to you by Rogers Xfinity, connecting you to more of what you love. Visit Rogers.com for more details. The following program was provided by a valued member of our local community. Rogers TV is proud to support local producers and share local